Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by a return guest, Dr. Joel Marks. He's Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of New Haven and Bioethics Center Scholar at Yale University. I'm also leaving a link to our first interview where we talked a lot about moral anti-realism, desirism, and topics like that. And today we're going to focus mostly on his book, The Spread, and other essays on moralism and guilt, but we're also going to talk more generally about moral realism and anti-realism, desirism, and other related topics. So, Dr. Marks, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo. Very nice to be back with you.
So let me start by asking you then also, because to try to contextualize the conversation here a little bit and talking about moral realism and anti-realism, where would you say morals stem from?
Well, I think there must be several answers to that question. For example, a biologist, of course, or a social biologist might look for an evolutionary answer, a Darwinian answer. Somehow morality has served a purpose, contributing to the survival of our species, or at the very least has not inhibited the survival of our species. I am not especially qualified to give a biological answer. I'm currently much more interested and I guess I'd call it a psychological answer. Even though I'm a philosopher by trade, I do have some background in psychology. That is where my studies actually began. And for probably all my career, even though I focused mainly on ethics, there's always been a strong psychological component of how I have done my ethical philosophizing. So to get right to your question, my thinking is that desire is where it starts. Now I'm totally speculating here, informed by my studies, by my experience, and so forth and so forth. But my strong hunch is that it begins with all human beings desiring, well, I might say that things turn out well, even for the best. There's a bit of question begging there, because then I'd have to say, well, what does that mean? What does it mean for things to be for the best and so forth? And ultimately, I would want to give a psychological answer to that as well. In effect, I'd want to say we desire what we desire, and not hold out for there being some kind of objective good that we desire. No, something becomes good because we desire it. So perhaps the way I should put this is to say that we have a hierarchy of desires. Obviously, some of our desires are stronger than others. So when it comes to the things that we desire most, and here again, it doesn't have to imply that we all have the same desires, okay? But whatever it is that we desire most, we desire with such strength that we cannot tolerate the possibility that our desires might not be satisfied. And so I think that by some kind of psychologic, which is not really logical in some purer sense, our desiring something so strongly induces in us a belief that the world ought to be a certain way. In other words, it ought to be the way we want it to be. And that, I think, is where morality begins. As soon as desiring something becomes believing that it ought to be that way, I think we introduce morality into the world. That's my short answer.
That's fine. So, but getting more specifically into some of the topics that you explore in your book, The Spread, what would you say are the roles played by behaviors like blaming, emotions like guilt and shame? What kind of roles do they play in morality?
Well, see, there's a whole bunch of concepts which go together. And starting with, I suppose, morality itself, the concept, all right? And here again, given the diversity of the world, the diversity of human thinking, desires, and now beliefs, there will be many different concepts of morality. But it does seem to be that, well, at least in my knowledge and my experience, the concept of morality will tend to bring along these other concepts that you've mentioned. So, for example, if you believe that things ought to be a certain way, then if somebody does something that goes against that, well, we might say that they've done something wrong. And then if we believe somebody has done something wrong, we might feel that they deserve, there's another moral concept, blame, another moral concept. And if the person we believe has done something wrong happens to be oneself, then the self-blaming is in effect guilt, or the feeling of guilt. So that's where they all come in. And, you know, these are commonplace concepts, at least in, what should I say, Western society. You know, the societies that I'm most familiar with, although I do have some knowledge of non-Western philosophies, although I can't say that I have much knowledge of non-Western societies. Their philosophies I know something about, the stuff you get from book learning, but I have not lived in a non-Western society and so forth. But I would imagine you'll find something similar, something analogous there as well.
Mm-hmm. But then emotions like guilt and shame, I mean, the way they play out psychologically, they sort of bring about a form of self-control, right? I mean, people, they live in a particular kind of society that is where certain particular moral values are dominant, and then if they go against those moral values or against the norms that are prevalent in that society, then it's when they might feel guilt or shame. So those emotions serve a function of also self-control, or not?
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. Again, here I would be going into yet another field, you know, the social sciences, right? Again, that's not my field, but certainly just as a layperson, and also, of course, having read some things in those other fields, I had that sense that morality amounts to internalizing something that certainly for most, if not all of us, must come from the society in which we grow up. So the society can, of course, exert external forces upon us, most obviously and explicitly in statutory laws, criminal laws, and so forth. But yes, there are subtler ways. You know, society helps to constitute who we are, even as individuals. Starting with parents, I suppose, but ultimately the entire society, the entire culture. And certainly a huge part of that would be internalizing a morality that is somehow, present all around us. And this may be a good place for me to introduce another idea that I spoke of there being different concepts of morality. One very basic kind of distinction I think you would find is between morality as what I guess the sociologists would call mores, which, you know, again, with the notions of right and wrong or proper behavior in a given society. But then there would be something that is you might say, more metaphysical, what I tend to speak of as objective right and wrong, objective good and bad. And these are things, speaking, in the metaphysical sense now, metaphysical things, entities, that I don't believe in, but I think that most people do believe in, and I think what constitutes the sociologists' mores, or what I sometimes call empirical morality, would be based on a belief in that metaphysical idea or those metaphysical notions. So the belief, of course, is something real. It's a real psychological phenomenon that somebody might have, but what they believe in would be, this seemingly metaphysical notion of an objective rightness, an objective wrongness, etc.
And so is that the same? I mean, moral philosophers themselves, is that the way they also think about objective moral values? Are they, when they use this expression, objective moral values, are they also imbuing moral values with some kind of metaphysical reality to them and claiming that moral values exist even independent of human minds or other animal minds, for example?
Yeah, well, that's the big issue. There are certainly, traditionally, I suppose, it was a straightforward metaphysical belief, a belief in something metaphysical. Although I suppose some people might question that as well, but I think that's a common view. But more recently, meaning in recent centuries, and certainly in the kind of Western philosophy and philosophical ethics I'm acquainted with, not necessarily theological ethics. That's again another whole other bag, right? But in philosophical ethics, the trend has certainly been to try to demetaphysicalize the notions of right and wrong, good and bad. And here it gets very, very, very tricky, because I would say most philosophical ethics do want to preserve the idea of a real morality. There really are things that are right and wrong and good and bad. But since they're rejecting the metaphysical view, what's going to take its place? And so, as I say, it becomes very tricky. And I think you find a wide variety of attempts to secularize an objective right and wrong, good and bad. I don't particularly want to go through an inventory of the various attempts that have been made, but to cut to the chase, I myself and a handful of others in modern philosophy, again meaning the last 100 or more years, people even with like Nietzsche and so forth, we have kind of rejected the whole notion of an objective right and wrong and good and bad. I mean, that makes it so much simpler. We don't have to come up with some elaborate, complex, subtle. I mean, there really have been good attempts. I mean, they can be very persuasive. And I can't say that I myself completely reject all of them. I have an open mind. I'm a philosopher. I can never really come to a final conclusion about anything. All right. But by and large, I have become convinced that it just makes a lot more sense. It would work out more to, I think, the collective liking of human beings if we had a world in which we just didn't believe anymore in an objective right and wrong and good and bad.
But then, in terms of morality, if you reject the idea of objective moral values, I mean, do you have a subjective approach to morality? Do you use terms like that or not?
Well, again, you'll find different points of view about this as well, because even among the philosophers who reject a moral realism in terms of, well, wait, see, again, everything is so complicated in philosophy because every term can be debated, all right? So I shouldn't even use the word realism yet. Okay, let me just go back to metaphysical. Even those who would reject a metaphysical notion of morality might still want to hold on to the vocabulary of morality. A lot of these people call themselves fictionalists. So they would hold on to a belief that they don't really believe. It would be a pretend belief, so that they could continue to use the vocabulary of morality. And their argument would be because it's very useful. It obviously, again, from an evolutionary standpoint, believing in morality in a very strong sense must have served a purpose. But these fictionalists would argue that, well, now that those of us who really think about this don't believe in that hardcore kind of morality, nonetheless, we can still see the benefit in retaining some of the gestures, as it were, of morality, some of the psychological attitudes that go around with morality. And it would just be too dangerous and ultimately just wouldn't work out well for the individual or society if we got rid of the terminology. But then others of us, like myself, who tend to go by the name of moral abolitionists as opposed to moral fictionalists, we feel it would be better even to get rid of the terminology, not to be a schoolmarm about it and say no, you shouldn't do it, because if we say you shouldn't do that, we're going to be moralists again, right? So we don't want to go that far, but we do want to encourage people to go easy, to go light on the use of right, wrong, good, bad. And more recently, I myself, in this latest book that we're talking about, I even go so far as to say, let's stop talking about truth and falsity. I know you want to ask me about that later in the conversation, but I'll just throw that in now. But just talking about right and wrong, good and bad now. Yeah, I think it would be better. And why? Because I think if we continue to use moral terminology, I think inevitably it's going to bring along with it the attitudes, the metaphysical attitudes. It's just, it's so ingrained in us that if we really want to get rid of the metaphysical attitudes, I think ultimately we have to get rid of the language as well.
So going back to perhaps the first question I asked you when I asked you where moral values stem from, I mean, there's another particular point there that I would like to address, because there are some moral philosophers that I would imagine would place themselves on the moral realist camp that in reaction or in response to some scientific accounts of morality and moral values, I mean, whether it is evolutionary approaches, social learning, anthropology, game theory, behavior economics, so any of those approaches, they say that we do not have a full account of morality or where moral values stem from. But I'm not claiming here that we already have that full account through science or any of these sciences. But if science would not account or would not fully account for where moral values stem from, then what would account for it? I mean, because it's hard for me to understand people when they make that kind of claim that science itself cannot fully explain where moral values stem from.
What can I say? I mean, there'll be so many different responses to that. So, some, are going to just say, well, they came from God, right? Going back to the metaphysical notions. And I gave you my own psychological account, of where they could come from. I would say I imagine that, and this is going to overlap with some of the more scientific versions you already alluded to. I would imagine that playing the moral card must give people, or must make people think it gives them a certain advantage. For example, when I hear politicians use morality, it strikes me that they're just trying to buttress their arguments, whatever they are. So they'll say, well, I am supporting this policy, or you should vote for me, because blah, 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 blah. And then they end it with, and it's the right thing to do. I call it moral punctuation. I'm probably repeating some things I said in our first interview, but it does seem to me that people feel there's an advantage to doing it. And I acknowledge that. I mean, if I'm debating somebody who is very confident about their position on whatever it is, a practical matter, a philosophical matter, whatever it is, their confidence might derive from their believing that morality is on their side. Especially if we're talking about some extreme situation, like something which is atrocity a moral term? It probably is. And there's certainly many times when I view something which, I am just naturally going to want to label it an atrocity. And then if somebody then says to me in a debate about morality and amorality, now, what do you think about that? Wasn't that an atrocity? Are you telling me it's not wrong? The person who did that didn't do anything wrong? Well, I'm at an extreme rhetorical disadvantage, right? It sounds terrible for me to say, no, I don't think they did anything wrong. It's absurd, right? It's absurd. Well, how do I get around that? Well, I mean, theoretically, how do I get around that? Theoretically, I'm going to say, yeah, but I really, I'm repelled by it. I really don't want things like that. I'm very motivated to try to prevent things like that and discourage things like that from happening. And I would certainly want to stop somebody from doing something like that. So I would give all these psychological answers, not moral answers. I would talk about what I feel. And I think that's enough to help make the world be the way I'd like it to be. If everybody shared the feelings I have, I certainly would think it would be a better world as a result. It would just be superfluous to add on top of that, oh, and by the way, it's the right thing to do, But as I say, rhetorically, somebody can use that right-wrong language to put an amoralist at a disadvantage.
So let me ask you this question that is also sort of related to the previous one. So let's say that someone is an atheist and they go around condemning religious people for believing in things that they think do not exist, gods or some other kind of divine entity. But at the same time, they believe that moral values are objective. And so they think that moral values are as real and as part of the universe as atoms, for example, and we can find them through whatever means. I mean, does that make sense? Does it make sense to condemn someone for believing in something, gods in this case, that an atheist thinks does not exist, but then believing, also holding these sort of beliefs that sound very similar to that, but in another camp, in this case, morality?
Well, you're giving me a leading question. I mean, thank you. Of course, I think it's ridiculous to try to reconcile those beliefs and attitudes. And I think the so-called new atheists, who aren't so new anymore, and whom I certainly respect a great deal. I mean, I'm certainly in sync with a lot of their attitudes, but I think they just are mistaken in this case. They are at cross purposes, and I would, just as you've suggested, I would say they still believe in a kind of God, that objective right and wrong and good and evil, or good and bad, amount to believing in God, to think that God's in his heaven and all's right with the world, and there is somebody who will make it all right in the end, and all that relates to the desire I spoke to at the beginning of our discussion today, that we desire something so strongly. It's not only a case that we bring the ought into existence, the world ought to be a certain way, but of course we bring God or gods into existence, the ones who are going to make it be the way we want it to be and think it ought to be, or even tell us how it ought to be and establish that is why it ought to be that way, just because the gods think it ought to be that way or want it to be that way. They're all of a piece, it seems to me. So that's why I coined the term hard atheism, for an atheism that is thoroughly honest, or at least self-aware, that is going to give up not only an explicit God, but the implicit God of an objective morality.
Mm-hmm. So in our previous conversation, we touched a little bit on desirism, and today I would like to get into more detail on that topic. So first of all, just to recap, would you like to tell us again what desirism is about?
Sure. If we decide to get rid of morality, as it were, yeah, I don't really like the term abolitionism either, because again, I'm not going to abolish, right? But that's the term that I inherited from whoever coined it. All right. But if we get rid of morality, we don't believe there's metaphysical morality, and we just kind of stop using the language and so forth and so forth. Well, the people who don't like amorality often say, well, you'd end up with chaos, or people, raping and pillaging and murdering and blah, blah, blah. The same kinds of arguments that theists make about atheists. Again, there's another parallel right there. And just as atheists think that's ridiculous, there are certainly lots of atheists who are upstanding, wonderful, compassionate individuals, just as much as there are theists like that. And we certainly know many theists who aren't like that, right? So, the same thing with moralism and amoralism. You're going to have some, real stinkers who are moralists and real stinkers who are amoralists, no doubt. But in an attempt to come up with a form of amorality that will satisfy even a moralist who was a very nice, upstanding person, I wanted to suggest some things. I don't just want to say get rid of morality, right? I want to offer some kind of alternative. Now, getting rid of morality is a big part of it. All right. I do think that will help to make the way smoother. It's going to get rid of a lot of things that can cause unnecessary conflicts and so forth. That's a big argument that many of the amoralists will make. Will reduce the number of conflicts and the intensity of conflicts in the world. But desirism specifically is the idea that we're left with what we want, or what we like, or what we don't want, or what we don't like. That's pretty much the basis of what will motivate us to do things or not do things, in lieu of, thinking it's right or wrong, good or bad. And then I add one more wrinkle to that. So choosing the name Desirism it's not the happiest of names for what my view is. And this is a constant problem for any theory. The name never really fully captures what a theory is, because theories tend to be rich entities. Okay. But the other wrinkle I'll throw in, that I've thrown in, is that you want to rationalize your desires. And now this opens a whole new can of worms, all right? Because then we have to talk about rationality, which I want to do with you. But that would be the essence of desirism. Desirism says, instead of trying to figure out what's the right or wrong thing to do, ask yourself, what is the rational thing to desire or like? That's it. That's rationalism in a nutshell.
Okay, but then we have to get a bit deeper into that bit about rationality.
Yes.
So I mean, because I have to ask you at this point, what does rationality mean in the context of desirism specifically?
Right. That turned out to be the real kicker. And I've been struggling with that for the whole time I've been thinking about desirism and immorality, which is how long now? Going on maybe 18 years or something since I had my so-called anti-epiphany that morality doesn't exist. That was a real shocker to me, a real shocker. Okay. Again, morality, well, that's a favorite. Rationality. That's a favorite concept of philosophers in particular. I mean, some would say precisely what distinguishes philosophy from, religion is that it insists upon a strictly rational approach to the big questions, whereas theology, I shouldn't say religion, theology. No, I shouldn't say theology. Everything is so complicated, Ricardo. I'm sorry. This is what happens when you're a philosopher. You can hardly get one sentence out before, contradicting yourself. How can I just say, calm down, Joel, calm down. Okay, there are many things that one can mean by rationality. So when I first started using the term, I meant what is pretty standard in philosophy, is that you think logically. You vet. We say you vet your beliefs with logic, and there are strict laws of logic. Even Aristotle came up with a lot of them. This goes back a long way, and I mean, my God, he was such a genius to come up with these things. And they've, many of them have stood the test of time. So you want to think logically, and we would also, in a more modern sense, say you want to think scientifically, or we want to think in terms of inductive logic. Some people talk about things that conform to probability theory and scientific theories and all that kind of thing. So not certainly we don't expect that you have to resolve everything deductively. You can't. I mean, nothing in the real world, in the world of experience, even scientific laws, none of these can be established deductively. Even scientists fully recognize that now. But nonetheless, there are standards. And they are considered objective standards, okay, of what constitutes a rational belief, or accordingly an irrational belief, or a fallacious belief, which is another way of speaking of something that's not strictly rational. So that's what I had in mind originally when I suggested that we vet or rationalize our beliefs. But more recently, with my book on ethics and reason, or was it Reason and Ethics? I think it was Reason and I've written so many books now, Reason and Ethics, and then The Spread, the most recent. And now I've got another one being considered for publication. In these more recent books, I'm taking a more relaxed view of rationality, because I familiarized myself with the objection to amoralism that goes by the name of companions in guilt, which argues, it has many forms, of course, but one form is that rationality is just as much you might say, a metaphysically based attitude as morality can be. And I thought about that, and I became convinced that that was true too. Oh, look what I just said, that was true too. I'm going to have to qualify that in a minute too. Yeah, because, where do we get this idea that you can only think in these terms? There are these laws of inference, deductive or inductive, etc., etc. Who says? I mean, yeah, they intuitively grab us, at least some of us, those of us who think that we're very logical. We say, of course. Just like 2 + 2 = 4. Of course. But then, isn't it just like, well, you don't want to go around torturing babies, do you? Of course not. It's the same kind of intuition that comes very naturally and that it seems absurd to deny. But having become convinced that it can be denied in the realm of morality, why should I be so confident that it can't be denied in the realm of rationality? And so finally, as I say, I did become convinced that it can be denied there as well. So what do I do then? Do I become an a-rationalist, the way I think of myself as an amoralist? Well, yes, but now I'm going to say something which has become my ultimate meta philosophy of life. Yes and no. I speak now of the philosophy of yes and no. Because I kind of think you can give a plausible yes and no answer to every question. So yes, I have now become an a-rationalist, but no, I can also give you a concept of rationality which I can live with. It's a laid-back concept, as I think I said, where all I mean by it is that I'm asking you to reflect on your beliefs. before you act upon them. So now a desirist is someone who reflects on their beliefs before acting on them. It's that simple.
But then let me just ask you this question more directly. Here, are you against morality or just against moralism?
Ah, good. Because in line with what I had just said about how I can live with a laid back sense of rationality, one might suppose, if I'm going to be consistent, which I like to be because I like rationality. I like it, right? So if I'm going to be consistent, then why not have a laid back sense of morality too? You know, and that I think is what many of the non-metaphysical moralists have been attempting to develop all these for the last couple of centuries, you know. And as I said, well, I just found it simpler to get rid of morality, you know. But hey, you know, arguments pro and con, all right? And it's also important to note that these are empirical questions, all right? I am very much an empirical-minded philosopher. And I recognize that, you know, because these are empirical questions, I cannot claim to have definitive answers. And that's not only because I'm not a scientist in the formal sense, because I think that a non-scientist can be very empirical in their studies as well. I think I am being very empirical when I'm in my armchair doing philosophy, because I'm thinking about daily life, which is an empirical phenomenon. What would I do? What would other people do? What do other people I know do or say? Da, 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 da. That's an empirical study too, all right? Mm-hmm. But even science recognizes, as I pointed out when saying science doesn't look for deductive answers, even science recognizes that it's not necessarily now or ever in possession of the absolute truth. So in that sense, you know, I'm open, very open to the possibility that it might make more sense in the end to live with a laid-back morality instead of having an out-and-out amorality. Okay? But you had asked me about moralism. So one way I can split the difference here is to say, well, okay, I do still want to get rid of morality for various reasons, blah, blah, blah. But let's have this conceptual distinction between morality and moralism. Oh, wait, excuse me. I just misspoke. I could say, yes, let us hold on to a laid-back morality, okay, but what we want to get rid of is moralism. And in fact, we already have in everyday speech in English. You can tell me if that's the case in some other languages, Ricardo, because I know you're probably a linguist. I'm not. But certainly in English, the term moralism usually connotes something not so nice. You know, you're just getting carried away with your morality there. You know, relax a little bit, in other words, right? And it also suggests a kind of arrogance, somebody who's very moralistic in the sense of moralism as opposed to moralistic in the sense of just moral. So, yeah, that's definitely something I've become more open to after 18 years of being an amoralist. I'm a little more moderate now in my amoralism. It can be, you see the term itself, it can be an amoralism instead of an amorality. I could maybe live with that.
Okay, but then in your work, one of the things that you say we should try to do is to abolish moral language. But if we were able to do that, then how would we refer to values that are then part of that more laid-back morality? Would we refer to them as, I don't know, personal preferences or something like that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, see, now we've got two paths here. Okay. So if we're going to be laid back moralists, then we don't have to get rid of the moral language necessarily, or we can use it from time to time as appropriate, you know. But we might also still choose, and I kind of, you know, I still have a preference to be a thoroughgoing amoralist, you know. So as I said, we have two paths. So one way I could answer your question is to say, well, we don't have to really change our language so much, okay? But the other way I would answer it as a thoroughgoing amoralist, and perhaps I should argue in those terms, you know, for most of our discussion, because, you know, that's my claim to fame. I'm an amoralist, and I've been considered really, perhaps even the most extreme one in philosophical circles recently. And I'm kind of proud of that. And I don't mind, you know, even playing, as it were, devil's advocate, but you know, I personally like it. All right. So I'll go that route. So what language would I use to talk about something which a moralist, you know, would say is just bad, evil, atrocious, horrible, outrageous, da 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 da. Well, you know, I think we have lots of language for that. You know, another way I could go, by the way, you know, actually, this is a third path that occurs to me now. And your questions, as always, are spurring me on to think, which is the beauty of philosophical dialogue, right? That's why, you know, the best possible way to do philosophy is in a dialogue, because another person is going to point out to things that you in your own little head just didn't think of. All right. Yeah. So now it occurs to me that it's really a third path, the relativistic path. Because one thing I could say is, in a subjectivist tone, I could say, well, I think it's wrong, you know? So instead of saying it's wrong, if I were just speaking as either a hardcore moralist or even a laid-back moralist, you know, it's wrong. I could be a relativistic moralist and say, well, I think it's wrong. You know, I recognize that you may consider it not wrong. See, I could go that route. Or as a pure amoralist, I could say, well, moderately, I could say, I don't like that. You know, in an aesthetic, you know, if we're talking aesthetics, which I think, again, is another realm, just like morality, where you have the same kinds of issues, I could say, well, you know, Beethoven, I love, you know, I love Beethoven, but, you know, the Beatles aren't my cup of tea. Actually, I love the Beatles too, but, you know, I could use like and don't like, or, you know, love, subjective, obviously subjective terms, without making an issue of it. Oh, Beethoven is the best composer there ever was. Objective fact. You know, in my objectivist mode, I sure think that, right? But in my purely subjectivist and even amoralist mode, no, I can just say, I love him. Every opportunity I have, you know, I'm going to go listen to Beethoven, and I'd like to encourage you to listen. You know, I know you don't care so much for Beethoven now, but maybe if you know, listen to this particular piece, you know, we could start with that, or, you know, or let me point out some things about the melodic structure of this piece that maybe you didn't pay attention to before, you know, so there are all sorts of ways I can subjectively try to convince people to come along to my way of seeing things. And remember, one part of Desirism, and that I used to refer to as rational, and again, I could still do that in an easygoing way. I could still say, look, let me give you reasons, because the whole notion of rationality comes from the idea of giving reasons, you know, having reasons for things. I I would always want to say, not just that, oh, well, I like this, or I really hate that, or I really don't want you to do that. I could also give reasons. I could say, and here's why, right? That's to be rational. I want people to reflect upon what they're doing or what they're not doing, to encourage them to do something or to discourage them from doing something, right? In a critical situation, of course, call the building's on fire. Well, of course, I want to say, hey, because the building's on fire, let's get out of here, right? So even in a critical, urgent situations, we give reasons, right? So they're just about always appropriate. And so it wouldn't just be a case of substituting the language of like, don't like, want, don't want. And again, we have various gradations of that, obviously, in English and other languages, for the language of right, wrong, good, bad. No, it would also involve giving reasons as part of explaining why I have the likes and tastes that I do, and why I want you to have the likes and dislikes and so forth that I want you to have. So there's a lot more to it than just substituting one word for another.
Mm-hmm. So let's take one step further now, because we were still in the realm exclusively of morality, but then last time I think you just alluded very briefly to another thing that I would like to ask you about now. What is Analetheism or Letheism? And I hope I'm pronouncing the word correctly, but tell us about it.
Don't ask me, it's Greek to me. That's a pun, folks. I think other people have used that term, or maybe one person, and I don't know if they're using it the way I did. All philosophers use terms in their own ways, but the Lethe, was the Greek river, the river between the world and Hades, the above ground and the below ground, I think. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. So when you die, you forget everything and go to the underworld for whatever purpose. I hope I got that right, my Greek mythology there. And so aletheism is a philosophical term of art, which is, or an is a negation prefix. So aletheism, just like amorality, irrationality, aletheism would be not forgetting, which is, so aletheism would be a theory of truth. You see,
right?
Forgetting somehow has become in philosophical lingo referring to a theory of truth. So then I now want to deny truth, that there is such a thing as truth. And so I came up with the term Analetheism, the denial of forgetfulness. And we could just shorten that, because two negatives are a positive, right? Or as Morgenthau once said, well, no, that's a joke. I won't bring in that joke. That's a tangent. But we can get rid of the two negatives and just say Letheism for short, getting back to forgetfulness here. So it's just a fancy term, my fancy term, for saying that there's no such thing as truth. And here again, we can go the different routes, right? We can say, well, let's just be laid back about it and say, there's truth, but we don't mean it in any metaphysical sense. Or we can be relativistic about it and say, well, I believe this is true, or I believe this is false. Or we can go all out Letheist about it and say, there's no truth. Now, how did I get around to that idea, which, is to some people just so obviously self-defeating? Because if I'm claiming that there is no truth, am I not claiming that that's true?
Right.
Well, the way I get around it is analogous to how I get around using right and wrong and good and bad. And because some people would make the same kind of argument to amorality. They'd say, oh, are you saying it's wrong to be moralistic, And the way I got around that was just to say, no, I'm just talking in terms of what I like and don't like. So analogously, or desire and don't desire, I'm sorry. So analogously, I would say, well, I'm going to get around, if I want to go hardcore atheist, I'm just going to go around saying, well, I believe this and I don't believe that. That's all. Very simple. Well, some people would say, hey, but if you believe something, you believe it's true. I mean, that's the very concept of believing. And I say, well, that's your analysis of belief. It's not mine. Philosophy is fun. Philosophy can be pure wish fulfillment. But, I take these things very seriously. There's no problem in having fun with the work you do, but it can have very serious implications. And we did talk a lot about those in our first interview. And yes, if we have time, we'll do that this time too. But, I do mean this quite seriously. Again, this relates to what I had mentioned a little earlier about my answering every question yes and no now. It's another way of saying, well, there's, we can have, this could be true, it could be false. We can even say that about truth itself. Yes, there has to be such a thing as truth, or no, there doesn't have to be such a thing as truth. And belief, you have on and on and on and on and on. Now, will I ultimately trip myself up? If I really, really, really try to make this a completely coherent theory that makes sense and actually relates somehow or other to reality, am I ultimately going to be, tripping on my own feet here? I don't know. Time will tell. But this is just another of those perennial issues, which is never going to be resolved. That's why there's always going to be philosophy, because these issues will never be resolved. So I stake my position. I defend my position. I take it with somewhat of a grain of salt, but I have to say I'm very deeply convinced of all these things. Now, I probably have veered from your question. Were you asking me how did I come about believing this in the first place, this atheism?
No, actually, that was the question I was going to ask now. So,
okay,
how did you arrive at atheism? Do you see it, for example, as a continuation, just a normal continuation from amoralism?
Yes. Yeah. And again, I think it came from dealing with the companions in guilt objection. It's called companions in guilt, just because it's claiming that morality and rationality are equally guilty. So if you think morality is guilty of something, you ought to think rationality is guilty of something. And I told you my response was to seize the bull by both horns and say, okay, yeah, they're both guilty. So I'm giving up rationality too, if I'm going the pure irrationality, amorality route. So when I thought, more and more about giving up rationality in particular, it did seem to me that rationality, in its pure extreme metaphysical sense, goes hand in hand with the idea of truth and falsity. And so if you give up one, you kind of give up the other. That was my general thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then let me ask you, because this is something that probably many people will be wondering about. So when it comes to the idea of abolishing morality or people becoming amoralists, in your estimation, do you think that it is feasible for us as humans to do that?
That is the question that I've certainly grappled with all along, but that has central place in the book I've just written, which has the tentative title Ethical Health. And the subtitle is Managing Our Moral Impulses. Because, I have tried to walk the talk. I don't just want to be philosophizing theoretically. As I said, I'm a very empirically minded philosopher. And so I wanted to know if it was really possible to become an amoralist. I'm not sure, in considering the people I know personally or the people I know, just via reading or media or whatever. I'm not sure if there are folks out there who would be full-fledged amoral in the sense that I theorize about and promote. I kind of think some are. I actually toy with the idea that Jesus might have been an amoralist. I mean, who knows what Jesus was actually like, right? We all have our favorite Jesus. But, there are many aspects of Jesus's life, as I know about it, through secondary, tertiary, etc. sources, that make me think he might have been an amoralist. But anyway, I wanted to see if I could become an amoralist, and not simply to test my theory, but because I really thought it would make my life better. So I've been struggling to do that, and through the years, I've had my ups and downs, both in terms of thinking that I was able to be amoral and in terms of whether I thought it was making my life better to be this way. I can say now, after 18 years, I am more convinced than ever that my personal experience bears out the possibility of becoming amoral, and that it makes things more, I don't want to say better, it's too objective, more to my liking. And I think the liking of people who know me, who have to interact with me. All right. And by the way, one probable repercussion of this is how I've gotten more laid back about morality, as we've been discussing, right? Because it does make me more laid back, I think, to become more, tolerant is a word we use. But so many would remark about me that I'm a very emotional person. I would remark that about me. I am a very emotional person. I feel everything very deeply. And so it has certainly been a very great struggle for me to tone it down. Because and that's why I, even when I became an amoralist, became a very emotional amoralist, which made me very liable to being moralistic, right? Because moralists tend to be, well, I shouldn't say that either. See, this is why I'm qualifying everything, right? No, moralists don't have to be absolutely confident about everything. Only the ones who embrace moralism, right? But you can certainly be a very reasonable, rational moralist who always recognizes that, they might be mistaken in their moral convictions, even though they feel them deeply. Yes, of course, there are moralists like that too. All right. So I'm willing to grant all that. I just want to say now that I think an amoralist has the potential to do it even more effectively. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but let me just ask you a follow-up to that, perhaps because of an objection that some people might have to your amoralist position here, and this will also be my last question for today. So, I mean, some people would probably object to you in this way. They would probably say that if people became amoralists, then there would be a big risk of them behaving in ways that we would consider immoral all the time. That is, mistreating other people and stuff like that. I mean, do you think that there's any merit to that objection or not?
Of course there is. Just as there's merit to the theist objection that an atheist might start raping and pillaging and murdering. But the question for somebody in reality, in the empirical world of experience that we know, is yes, but what are the likelihoods? What are the tendencies? It's always a matter of more and less in the real world. Anytime somebody institutes any policy, even if you're a social scientist promoting an economic policy, social, political policy, whatever, obviously some people are going to get it wrong. It's not going to work for everybody because you're always dealing with people who are totally diverse in terms of their beliefs, their genes, their cultures, their everything, or they might even have misheard what you said, or just so many ways things can go wrong, go to the way you weren't anticipating, right? See, I'm constantly looking for different ways to say things now. And there are always ways to do it. So yes, of course, but what's not logical or rational is to leap on those exceptions of what you hope are exceptions and say, you see. I mean, this is what demagogues do. This is what a certain presidential candidate in my country has been doing for years. He takes one case where an immigrant may have done something, not guilty till proven in a case of in a court of law. And even then there's doubt, right? But it looks like some immigrant has done something, that a moralist would say is horrible. And then I would say, I don't like that. I don't want that to be done ever by anybody. And that person needs to be dealt with somehow, so he'll leap on one, awful case like that and say, you see, we shouldn't allow any immigrants into the country, or illegal immigrants, and even dramatically cut down the percentage of a number of illegal immigrants coming here legally. He even cut down. All right. We don't want them. I hate this. I really don't like it. Right. So yeah, there's no way around that. If you're dealing with somebody who's going to argue in that way, and rhetorically, they may get away with it, who knows? All right. All I'm suggesting is the most that I think anybody can ever suggest when they think they've come upon something that might help to make the world more the way we'd all like the world to be, is here are my reasons for thinking so. If you agree, join the crowd. Let's together help try to change the world in this way. And that's it. I cannot promise you a rose garden.
Great. So the book that we've been focusing on today is, again, The Spread and Other Essays on Moralism and Guilt. Just before we go, Dr. Marx, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet, and also particularly about your upcoming book that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, thank you. Well, Amazon's the place to go, or any place else. I don't know. You're as good as I is figuring out where my books can be purchased or read and so forth. Also, of course, anybody is always welcome to contact me by email for a discussion. I love to talk, to dialogue with people. The book that I hope will be the next one out is, as I said, I think the title will be Ethical Health, where I'm really getting down to the real nitty gritty on how to go about transforming yourself into the sort of person, I've been talking about here, a so-called amoralist. I'd also like to just mention some names of other philosophers to you, Ricardo, and to our listeners, but people I'd love for you to invite to your program if you haven't already done so. It's hard for me to believe that you haven't invited them, since you've invited just everybody in the universe, it seems. But I did a quick search on your site, and I didn't find these names there. So if your search function is working correctly, I don't think you've had them. But I would say Martha Nussbaum, Stephen Morris, Ronnie D'Souza, Lucia Schwartz, Eric Campbell, Stephen Ingram, Russell. Oh, you've had Russell Blackford, Thomas Peltzler. These are marvelous people, and you know why I think they're marvelous? Because they agree with a lot of my ideas. But besides that, speaking purely objectively, these are really wonderful, excellent philosophers. So I hope someday to see them on your program as well. Thank you again so much for inviting me for another opportunity to talk about my thoughts.
Of course, and thank you so much for the suggestions and for coming on the show again. It's always an immense pleasure to talk with you. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbourd, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fort, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.